They stepped off the train expecting hostility, ruin, or perhaps even revenge. After all, these were prisoners of war, German soldiers who had fought against the Allies in North Africa, Italy, and across Europe. Instead, what greeted them in the United States was something they had not imagined. Instead of bombed-out ruins or rationed poverty, they found grocery stores overflowing with food, highways buzzing with traffic, and factories roaring with energy. Towns and cities stretched out in endless order, their warehouses and silos bursting with abundance. For men raised in a Germany defined by shortages and strict control, the sheer scale of America was overwhelming. Some prisoners whispered to each other, "How can we ever hope to win against a nation that can build like this?" It was not the battlefield that shocked them most, it was America itself. For many of these POWs, their time in the United States would become an eye-opening education, not only in the scale of industrial might but in the daily life of a democracy at war. This is the story of how German prisoners of war, once symbols of Hitler's ambitions, became witnesses to America's power. A tale of disbelief, adaptation, and unexpected cultural encounters that reshaped both captives and captors, and left a legacy far beyond the war. They were taken in dusty convoys across the burning deserts of North Africa, herded together in makeshift pens after Rommel's once proud Africa Corps had been shattered by British and American advances. Others surrendered in Sicily and Italy, their ranks thinning as the Wehrmacht's once unstoppable momentum bled away under the combined pressure of Allied firepower. By 1943, tens of thousands of German soldiers found themselves prisoners, far from the fatherland they had once believed destined to rule Europe. They expected to remain in the Mediterranean or Britain, close to the front lines. Instead, a new fate awaited them, one that would reveal a world they had only glimpsed through Nazi propaganda. Their captors were not content to keep them in Europe. They would send them across the Atlantic, deep into the heart of the United States itself. The voyage was disorienting. Loaded onto troopships that had previously carried American GIs to war, these men now traveled the opposite direction, crammed into holds under armed guard. Days turned into weeks on the Atlantic, and for many the crossing was the first time they truly grasped the scale of the Allied war machine. Convoys stretched beyond the horizon, Liberty ships stacked with supplies, destroyers cutting through the waves, aircraft carriers looming like floating cities. The Kriegsmarine's vaunted U-boats had once prowled these waters with menace, but now the balance had shifted. The ocean seemed to belong entirely to the Allies, and the Germans, huddled in confinement, could do little but watch as the full weight of industrial production glided above the waves in endless procession. When the ships finally nosed into American ports, Norfolk, New York, Boston, New Orleans, the prisoners pressed against whatever openings they could find for a glimpse of their new surroundings. What they saw stunned them. Massive harbors clogged with ships, cranes working day and night, mountains of crates and barrels stacked in endless rows. Docks teemed with longshoremen unloading food, ammunition, machinery, so much of it that the Germans muttered among themselves that no nation could ever be starved of supplies while such abundance existed. To men accustomed to rationing in Germany, to shortages and scrimping, the sight of warehouses bulging with goods seemed unreal. As they were marched from docks to trains under the watchful eyes of guards, they passed through American cities. Even brief glimpses through barred railcars left lasting impressions. Streets crowded with cars despite wartime gas restrictions, storefronts lit with neon, children well-fed and dressed, factories smoking with relentless production. Many POWs later confessed that it was here, not on the battlefield, that they realized how hopeless Germany's position had become. They had been told by Nazi propaganda that America was weak, divided, a nation of soft consumers incapable of fighting a real war. Instead, what they saw was energy, motion, and prosperity on a scale that dwarfed anything in Europe. The trains carried them inland, often for days at a time. As miles of farmland rolled past, their disbelief deepened. Field after field stretched farther than the eye could see, dotted with tractors, barns, silos. In Germany, farms were small, fragmented, often worked by hand. Here, mechanization was everywhere, great machines plowing, harvesting, hauling. For men raised in the structured, resource-scarce life of wartime Europe, it was like traveling through another world. They whispered among themselves that this endless food alone could sustain armies larger than Germany could ever muster. If this was the American heartland, how could their country ever hope to match it? The POWs journey did not end until they reached camps built across the American landscape, sprawling compounds in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Wisconsin, and dozens of other states. But even before stepping behind the barbed wire, the journey itself had changed something in them. The shock of the Atlantic convoys, the harbors filled with abundance, the bustling towns and highways glimpsed from train windows, all of it left them unsettled. Many admitted quietly that they had underestimated their enemy. Others grew silent, their faces betraying the slow realization that the Reich's promises of inevitable victory had been hollow from the start. What none of them could deny was the sheer scale of America. In Germany, war meant ruins, shortages, blackouts. In the United States, war seemed to mean production, mobilization, expansion. Factories did not close, they added new shifts. Railways did not groan under shortages, they pulsed with endless supply trains. Ordinary Americans did not starve, they bought war bonds and still lined up at stores brimming with goods. The prisoners had been raised to believe in the superiority of German efficiency and discipline, yet here, thousands of miles from the front, they saw a rival whose efficiency was measured not in slogans, but in steel, fuel, and food by the mountain. As the train doors clanged shut and the engines carried them deeper into America's interior, many of the German soldiers pressed their foreheads to the glass, straining to take in the sights. Long highways stretched into the horizon, lined with trucks ferrying goods. Small towns whizzed past, each with its own grain elevator, its own depot, its own water tower, symbols of self-sufficiency multiplied across the land. Even under guard, they could not help but compare it to the bombed-out cities of their homeland. Some muttered bitterly that they had been deceived, others sat in stunned silence. For the first time, many began to understand that they had been fighting an enemy whose strength did not lie only in weapons, but in the vast, unshakable foundation of industry and abundance. The camps were ringed with barbed wire and watchtowers, but for many of the German prisoners, life behind those fences felt less like punishment and more like an uneasy suspension between two worlds. When they first arrived, they expected brutality, starvation rations, backbreaking labor, perhaps even revenge for the destruction Germany had unleashed across Europe. They carried in their minds the memory of German stalags, where Allied prisoners often endured overcrowding, neglect, and cruelty. But as the gates clanged shut behind them and they began to experience American captivity firsthand, their preconceptions began to crack. The camps stretched wide across the landscape, some small compounds of a few hundred prisoners, others sprawling enclosures holding thousands. In Texas, in Oklahoma, in Kansas, in the Carolinas and the Midwest, the camps appeared almost overnight, neat rows of barracks flanked by kitchens, latrines, and parade grounds. Guards stood at the perimeter, rifles at the ready, but the atmosphere inside was surprisingly ordered. POWs were assigned bunks, given uniforms marked with large PW letters, and issued rations that, to their astonishment, often rivaled or even surpassed what American civilians themselves could find on the shelves. Where Germans expected to be half-starved, they discovered plates of meat, potatoes, bread, and vegetables. Coffee was abundant. Many would later admit, sheepishly, that they ate better as prisoners in America than as soldiers in the Wehrmacht. Discipline was firm, but it carried a strange sense of fairness. American guards, many of them young men barely older than the captives, enforced the rules without the cruelty the Germans had braced themselves for. Punishments existed for disobedience, but they were measured: solitary confinement, docked privileges, not the savage beatings that POWs had assumed were inevitable. The prisoners watched their captors with curiosity, trying to reconcile what they saw with the Nazi image of America as a decadent and divided society. Here were soldiers who carried themselves with confidence but joked casually with one another, officers who gave orders but were not above sharing cigarettes or chatting in broken German with the men they guarded. Over time, life in the camps developed a rhythm. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be allowed to maintain certain aspects of their cultural life, and many camps permitted orchestras, choirs, and even theater productions. Instruments were sometimes donated by local communities, eager to keep the men occupied, and soon evenings were filled with the sound of Beethoven or Bach drifting across the barbed wire. In other camps, German prisoners organized classes, mathematics, literature, even philosophy, taught by former school teachers or university students among them. Books were supplied, and libraries sprang up, stocked with both German classics and English-language texts. For men accustomed to the chaos of the front, the chance to study, to play music, to simply sit in peace and read was surreal. And then there were the small but jarring encounters with America beyond the fences. Farmers arrived with trucks, asking for laborers. Prisoners were marched out under guard to harvest cotton, wheat, or corn, working side by side with American civilians. They noticed the trust. Sometimes only a single guard watched over dozens of prisoners in the fields. Escape attempts were rare, not because of heavy surveillance but because there was simply nowhere to go. The land stretched endlessly, and the civilians they encountered often seemed less hostile than they had expected. Some offered water, or even food, with a casual kindness that confused the Germans who had been told they would be hated. The contrast with what they had known in Europe was impossible to ignore. In Germany, war had stripped the land bare. Cities lay in ruins, rations grew tighter by the month, and daily life was marked by shortages and fear. Inside America, even within prison camps, life was strangely abundant. Uniforms were washed and replaced when worn out, mail was delivered, Red Cross packages arrived. Some prisoners even received medical care superior to what they had known at home. One soldier, after being treated for an illness in a U.S. Army hospital, remarked in disbelief that he had been cared for better as a prisoner than as a soldier of the Reich. At night, the POWs lay awake in their bunks, listening to the sounds beyond the wire. Instead of bombs and sirens, they heard trains rumbling through the dark, hauling grain and steel across the country. They heard music drifting from radios in nearby towns, swing, jazz, unfamiliar but infectious. Sometimes, faint cheers carried from baseball games played just outside the camps. The prisoners whispered among themselves that this was a different kind of war. For America, war had not brought destruction to its soil but a strange kind of prosperity, a mobilization that seemed to enrich rather than impoverish. The more they saw, the more their image of their captors shifted. Some remained defiant, holding fast to Nazi ideology, sneering at the very abundance around them as wasteful or decadent. But others began to soften. They wrote home in censored letters, describing the odd kindnesses, the plentiful meals, the endless land. They marveled that they were allowed to organize their own activities, that guards sometimes treated them less like enemies and more like troublesome guests. The barbed wire was real, but it enclosed a world unlike anything they had imagined. Rumors spread through the camps of prisoners who had been taken in by American families for meals, or of small-town churches that invited groups of POWs to attend Sunday service. Some prisoners experienced moments that unsettled them deeply, a child waving at them from across a fence, a farmer offering a smile and a handshake after a day's work. These tiny acts of humanity eroded the caricature of Americans as brutish enemies. The Reich had told them they were fighting a nation of weaklings and mongrels. But here, behind the barbed wire, they saw a society that was disciplined yet free, strict yet generous. The days blended into months, and what began as captivity slowly became an education. Within the wire, the Germans organized, studied, built small gardens, carved wood, painted, wrote plays. Outside the wire, they glimpsed a country whose prosperity seemed untouched by war. The shock was not in the confinement, it was in the realization that their captors lived in a world far stronger, freer, and more abundant than they had ever imagined. And every day behind the fences, that realization cut a little deeper. The barbed wire was not a wall but a gateway. Beyond the fences, America demanded hands to keep its war machine running, and those hands often belonged to the very men who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler. German prisoners found themselves loaded into trucks at dawn, driven past stretches of farmland that seemed to roll on forever, or into factories where machines thundered and sparks lit the air like fireworks. What began as simple labor assignments soon became something more profound, a daily confrontation with the scale of America's industrial and agricultural might. In the fields of Texas, Kansas, and Iowa, German soldiers accustomed to small family farms back home were staggered by what they saw. Endless rows of wheat swayed under the wind, and tractors growled across the earth, pulling machinery that seemed monstrous compared to the tools of their villages. Harvesting, which in Germany was still often done by hand or horse-drawn implements, here was mechanized and swift. Combines rolled across the fields, reaping and threshing in one seamless motion. The prisoners bent their backs alongside American farmers, cutting, loading, stacking, but the machines set the pace. One prisoner later admitted that what shocked him most was not the abundance of land, but the speed at which American farmers could harness it. To him, each farm seemed less like a homestead and more like a factory planted in the soil. The scale of agriculture alone was enough to sow disbelief. Prisoners knew that Germany fought under constant rationing, with bread stretched by fillers, meat rationed to ounces, butter and coffee almost luxuries. Here in the American heartland, granaries bulged with surplus. Silos towered over small towns like monuments, stuffed with corn and wheat destined not just for Americans, but for armies overseas. Farmers spoke of quotas in thousands of bushels, numbers that seemed astronomical. Even when prisoners were put to work picking fruit or cotton by hand, they noticed how quickly trucks arrived to haul away the yield, how smoothly the system ran from field to rail to city. It was not just plenty, it was a network, a machine in itself. Then there were the factories. Some POWs were sent to logging camps or mills, but others found themselves in the shadow of American industry. Even if prisoners were not allowed to work directly in armaments plants, they sometimes labored on the periphery, loading raw materials, cutting lumber, handling supplies. They saw assembly lines stretching longer than city blocks, conveyor belts carrying parts that seemed endless in number, the hiss of welding torches, the clatter of rivet guns. German engineers among the prisoners studied the production floors with quiet awe, realizing that what took months to produce in Germany seemed to roll off American lines in days. What startled them most was the ordinariness of it. Factories were not hidden behind propaganda or secrecy, they were simply part of daily life. Whole towns pulsed to the rhythm of shifts, sirens sounding in the morning, whistles blowing at dusk. Everywhere, there were trucks, trains, barges ferrying goods. POWs saw warehouses stacked with crates labeled for shipment abroad, piles of boots, uniforms, canned rations, tires, spare engines. The abundance was not just overwhelming, it was casual, taken for granted. For men whose homeland was crumbling under Allied bombing, where shortages gnawed at every family, the contrast was painful to witness. The irony was never lost on them. They had once marched into battle convinced of Germany's superior efficiency, its legendary discipline, its unmatched ability to mobilize for war. Yet here they were, pulling corn from American fields, carrying lumber onto American trucks, watching workers in overalls produce more in a single shift than some German factories managed in a week. Nazi propaganda had painted America as a weak society, soft and distracted by luxury. What the prisoners saw instead was a society mobilized at every level, farmers, workers, even teenagers and women in coveralls, all pulling together with a drive that seemed inexhaustible. Prisoners wrote home, though their words were censored, hinting at what they witnessed. Some dared not put their awe into letters, but in whispered conversations they admitted the truth, they could not imagine Germany defeating such power. One soldier recalled standing in a Kansas wheat field under the blazing sun, looking at the horizon where machines harvested without pause, and thinking to himself that he was staring at the real secret weapon of the Allies. Another, working in a lumber mill, described how the timber rolled in from forests without end, stacked and cut and shipped by rail, while in Germany every plank was rationed, every nail counted. The encounters changed the prisoners. Some remained sullen, seeing only their humiliation as laborers in the land of their enemies. But others absorbed the lesson. They began to understand that America's strength was not built on conquest or forced labor, but on an industrial culture that treated abundance as natural and innovation as routine. The sheer confidence of the system shook their beliefs. Even the guards seemed less concerned with scarcity or fragility. They joked freely, smoked their cigarettes without worry, and watched the trains roll by as if victory was inevitable. For many Germans, working day after day in the fields and factories of the United States was more disarming than any weapon. Each truckload of wheat, each assembly line of parts, was another reminder of the scale of the struggle they were part of. They had seen Germany mobilize for war in desperation, squeezing the last ounce from its people and resources. Here, they saw a country mobilize with surplus, still feeding its people, still living in comfort, while pouring out ships, tanks, and planes at a pace the world had never seen. In the end, what broke their certainty was not the barbed wire, not the guards with rifles, not even the defeat of their armies overseas. It was the revelation that America's power seemed limitless, flowing from the soil, the factories, the very pulse of its daily life. And as the Germans worked among it, they realized they were witnesses to something their homeland could never match. When the prisoners first encountered ordinary Americans outside the wire, it unsettled them more than the rifles or the fences. They had been taught to expect hatred, suspicion, and even violence from civilians. After all, they were the enemy, men who had fought under the swastika, who had marched through France and North Africa with Hitler's war machine. Instead, what they often found were curious glances, cautious smiles, and in some cases, unexpected kindness. That contradiction gnawed at them, challenging everything they had been told about this distant, foreign land. At first the contact was limited. Farmers who needed help brought the POWs into their fields under guard. The work was hard, the sun relentless, but there was a strange civility to the arrangement. Women handed out water to the laborers, sometimes even slipping them food, treating them less like enemies than like weary workers. A few children, too young to understand the war's hatred, waved at the German soldiers as if they were just another group of farmhands. The prisoners, accustomed to the idea that Americans despised them, found themselves bewildered. One German later admitted that it was harder to maintain hatred for an enemy whose child had shyly offered him an apple during a break in the fields. The deeper they went into the American heartland, the more contradictions emerged. In towns near the camps, the Germans saw civilians who lived with confidence, not fear. Stores carried canned goods, clothes, radios, even luxuries that had long since disappeared from German shelves. They noticed how freely people spoke, even in public, openly criticizing political leaders or discussing the hardships of war without fear of arrest. In Germany, one careless word could mean a visit from the Gestapo. Here, it seemed that Americans argued and debated without consequence. Prisoners whispered among themselves that the decadent democracy they had been taught to despise looked surprisingly strong, and surprisingly free. Some of the POWs were invited into local churches for Sunday service, marched in under guard but seated alongside townsfolk. Hymns filled the air, familiar words sung in a new accent, and for a moment the Germans felt less like enemies and more like strangers sharing faith with strangers. Others were brought into community halls for Christmas dinners, where the holiday spirit outweighed suspicion. Sitting at long tables, they ate turkey and pie, foods they had only read about, served by families who could easily have turned them away. It was disarming. One soldier later recalled that he had expected bitterness from civilians whose sons were dying in Europe, yet he found grace instead, and it unsettled him far more than hostility would have. Music and sport became bridges between the cultures. Prisoners who had carried harmonicas or fiddles with them began to play in the camps, sometimes within earshot of American townsfolk. Before long, camp orchestras were performing for both prisoners and guards, their concerts drifting across the wire. Baseball games played nearby captured the POWs' fascination. They crowded against fences to watch, trying to make sense of a sport that seemed both chaotic and precise, with moments of stillness shattered by sudden bursts of action. Guards and prisoners debated the rules, laughed over mistakes, and even organized games of their own, with ragged equipment and improvised bases. Food remained one of the most vivid cultural shocks. Coca-Cola, served in ice-filled bottles, was a revelation to men raised in a Europe of shortages and rationing. Chocolate, chewing gum, peanut butter, ordinary staples of American life, became small luxuries that prisoners talked about endlessly in their barracks. Some traded for them with guards, others received them as small gifts from civilians. These tastes of abundance burned themselves into memory, reminders that even at war, Americans seemed to have more than enough. Not all encounters were friendly. There were civilians who resented the presence of German soldiers in their communities, who saw the camps as insults to families sacrificing loved ones overseas. Guards sometimes warned prisoners to keep their heads down when working in certain areas, and stories circulated of fistfights or verbal abuse. Yet even those moments reinforced the sense that America was different. Here, anger was open and public, not delivered by secret police in the dead of night. Disagreement was not dangerous, it was ordinary. To Germans who had lived under a totalitarian regime, even hostility carried its own lesson. Inside the camps, prisoners debated what they saw. Some clung stubbornly to ideology, dismissing American prosperity as wasteful or soulless. They mocked the consumer culture, sneered at the looseness of discipline, insisted that Germany's order and sacrifice were superior. But others, particularly the younger soldiers, were quietly shaken. They had been told that democracy bred weakness, yet they saw a nation both wealthy and powerful, capable of waging global war without collapsing into scarcity or fear. They compared the guarded conversations of their families back home to the open laughter of American civilians and began to doubt the stories they had been fed. The small moments stuck with them. A guard who slipped them a cigarette during a long day's work. A farmer who thanked them politely after a harvest. A young woman in a town who, with a mix of caution and curiosity, exchanged a few words in halting German before hurrying away. Each encounter chipped at the wall between enemy and human being. For many, the cultural shock was more disarming than the military defeat. They had expected America's weapons to be formidable, its armies to be strong. What they had not expected was to encounter a society that lived with such ease, confidence, and freedom. The POW camps were supposed to be prisons, yet for countless German soldiers they became classrooms, forcing them to re-examine what they thought they knew about the world and about the enemy they had been told to hate. By late 1944 and into 1945, the men behind the barbed wire knew the war was turning irrevocably against them. They heard it in the voices of new arrivals, gaunt men captured in France or the Ardennes, who spoke of Allied armies pushing relentlessly toward Germany. They read it between the lines of censored letters, hints of cities flattened by bombing, of shortages that had become desperation. And yet, even as news from home grew darker, life inside the camps carried on with a strange rhythm. The POWs harvested fields, worked in mills, attended makeshift classes, and observed an America that never seemed to falter. For many, the shock they had felt upon arrival had evolved into something deeper, a recognition that they had witnessed a force of history larger than themselves, and one that would linger long after the fences came down. When repatriation began, the Germans were loaded onto trains once more, bound for ports where ships waited to carry them back across the Atlantic. Their feelings were conflicted. Some longed for home, for family, for the familiar sounds of their language spoken freely. Others dreaded what they would find in a Germany devastated by war. But all carried memories of what they had seen in America, impressions that could not easily be dismissed. They remembered warehouses bursting with goods, the endless sweep of farmland, the booming factories. They remembered the odd kindness of strangers who had handed them water in the fields, or the sight of well-fed children playing baseball while their own families back home rationed every crust of bread. In the barracks of occupied Germany after 1945, when returning POWs reunited with comrades who had never left Europe, stories began to circulate. Men who had been shipped to America told of things that sounded unbelievable to those who had endured hunger and rubble at home. They spoke of supermarkets with shelves full of canned food, of farms with machines that harvested faster than entire villages, of prisoners treated not with cruelty but with a rough kind of fairness. At first, some listeners scoffed, assuming these tales were exaggerations or propaganda in reverse. But as more and more veterans returned with the same stories, disbelief gave way to fascination. For younger Germans, especially, the lessons sank in. Many of the prisoners had been teenagers when they were captured, indoctrinated by Hitler Youth rallies and Nazi slogans. In America, they had been confronted not only with military defeat but with a civilian society that contradicted everything they had been taught. They had seen democracy in action, not as weakness but as strength, and they carried that realization back with them. In the post-war years, as West Germany rebuilt under Allied occupation, these former POWs became quiet witnesses to the possibility of another path, a path that did not rely on fear and control but on abundance and freedom. Some went further. A number of former prisoners returned to the United States after the war, emigrating to the land that had once held them captive. They sought work in the very fields and towns where they had labored under guard, drawn back by memories of opportunity and prosperity. Others wrote memoirs or gave interviews decades later, describing their astonishment at America's scale and generosity. Their recollections often carried the same refrain, that it was not the weapons or the soldiers alone that had impressed them, but the sight of an entire nation mobilized, confident, and unshaken in the midst of war. The legacy of those camps also lingered in smaller, more personal ways. Some prisoners kept up correspondence with American families who had befriended them, exchanging letters across oceans even as the world reshaped itself. Decades later, reunions were held where former captives embraced the descendants of their guards or the farmers they had once worked beside. They spoke of friendships that had seemed impossible in 1943 but had endured into the late 20th century, proof that even in war, humanity could break through the walls of ideology. In Germany itself, the testimony of returning POWs played a subtle but important role in shaping perceptions of the United States. Nazi propaganda had painted America as a land of chaos and decadence, incapable of true strength. Yet the men who had lived in camps behind American fences told another story, of a society that valued fairness, that overflowed with resources, that operated with a confidence Germany could not match. These accounts chipped away at old beliefs and helped prepare the ground for West Germany's eventual alignment with the United States during the Cold War. For historians, the shock experienced by German POWs in America became a lens through which to view the larger story of the war. It revealed how industrial might and cultural openness could be as powerful as armies in reshaping minds. It showed that captivity was not merely confinement, but exposure to a world so different that it challenged loyalties and assumptions at their core. And for the men who had lived it, those years behind the barbed wire became a paradox, a time of defeat and humiliation, yes, but also a time of discovery that changed how they saw the world forever. As they stepped off ships back onto European soil, the barbed wire and watchtowers receded into memory, but the lessons remained. They had been witnesses to something larger than themselves, to a nation whose power was measured not only in tanks and bombers but in the abundance of its farms, the roar of its factories, and the quiet resilience of its people. And while Germany would rebuild in its own way, the memory of America's might, seen through the eyes of its prisoners, remained a reminder of how wars are won not only on the battlefield but in the very fabric of a nation's life. They had come as captives, marched under guard through strange towns and into fenced enclosures. But what stayed with them was not the barbed wire, it was the world beyond it. The endless farmland, the humming factories, the crowded shelves of American stores, the ordinary families living in comfort even during war. For many German POWs, their months or years in the United States were the most transformative experience of their lives. They entered convinced of Germany's strength, only to discover a nation whose power lay not just in weapons, but in industry, abundance, and confidence. In their disbelief, they carried home a truth that no propaganda could erase, that America's might rested on more than its armies. It rested on the ability to build, to feed, to innovate, and to share those strengths openly. German laughter, once dismissive of America, was silenced in the face of a reality too vast to deny. And in the end, the story of German POWs in the United States became more than a footnote of war, it became a lesson in how the unseen power of a nation can change hearts, minds, and even history itself.